Wait, I got tagged in? Oh, he just picked everybody. Okay. Yeah. What sucks? There was another workforce reduction at work today.
Oh yeah.
First of the month. I'm not surprised. Should be done by February. All right. So I think we're live.
Yep, we're live. So, uh, I'm going to start off by reading the first part of this out loud so we can start talking about it. Mechanism is the first chapter of objectivity. For those joining us on the YouTube, which I'm sure they're few, or they're watching after the fact, which is just fine, whatever, you know, don't join us now. I'm just kidding. All right. So, rather than try to preface this, I'm just going to start reading. This is in Hegel's language, so some of it might not make sense. So I'll try to provide some commentary or kick it to you, Kyle or Jim, however we do it. So mechanism. An objectivity is the totality of the notion withdrawn into its unity. An immediate is thereby posited, that is, in and for itself, this totality, and is also posited as such. Although it is the negative unity of the notion, although in it the negative unity of the notion has not as yet detached itself from the immediacy of this totality. In other words, objectivity is not yet posited as judgment. Feel like he restates a lot there, but that's all right. Um, Insofar as it has the notion immanent in it, it contains the difference of the notion, but on account of the objective totality, the differentiated moments are complete and self-subsistent objects, which consequently, even in their relation, stand to one another only as self-subsistent things and remain external to one another in every combination. So, what we're looking at is a unity or a totality that is made up of many things, but these things have a specific characteristic in that they are what they are, but they're not related to all of the other things in the totality as um, uh, uh, being mechanistic, right? And anyone familiar with any of the debates in the Soviet sphere as to science or politics or philosophy, anything to do with mechanism versus dialectical materialism, you'll find this. Well, my brain is not going to function to just rattle off stuff off the top of my head. I really have to think about it. Sorry. So yeah, it sounds mechanical because it is, right? It's pretty straightforward, but also in Hegel's words. Um, this is what constitutes, and he said, I should have just read the next damn sentence. This is what constitutes the character of mechanism, namely that whatever relation obtains between the things combined, this relation is one extraneous to them that does not concern their nature at all. Remember, they're self-subsistent, each one by themselves, right? Um, and I lost my place. Um, And even if it is accompanied by a semblance of unity, it remains nothing more than composition, mixture, aggregation, and the like. Spiritual mechanism also, like material, consists in this that the things related in the spirit remain external to one another and to spirit itself. A mechanical style of thinking, a mechanical memory, habit, a mechanical way of acting signify that the peculiar pervasion and presence, that's an interesting word choice, and presence of spirit is lacking in what spirit apprehends or does when it's being mechanical. Although its theoretical or practical mechanism cannot take place without its self activity, without an impulse and consciousness, yet there is lacking in it the freedom of individuality. And because this freedom is not manifest in it, such action appears as a merely external one. And all right, that's the end of it. The first thing I want to talk about is, and this is totally off of the subject, but when Hegel says that spiritual mechanism, also like material, consists in this that the things related in the spirit remain external to one another and to spirit itself. He's talking about the difference between, well, not so much the difference, but he's talking about how you're looking at what reality is materially made of and what thought is made up of. Okay. Previously, he has said that these two two domains are usually thought of as separate in previous philosophies, and the problems with that. But those who choose to see Hegel, because they've read some Marxist somewhere who said that Hegel is an idealist, this is one of those passages in which we come face to face with the fact that Hegel is perfectly aware that material reality and thought are related, and it's very hard to maintain the non-materialist reading of Hegel when you come across passages like this. And so, write it down, put it in your toolkit, highlight it right here, right now, because this is one of the examples that you can point to for people when you discuss the fact that, when whatever Marx may have said in commentary, his usage of dialectic reason, speculative reason in Capital and elsewhere, depended on the fact that thought and reality play by the same set of rules. And here Hegel is just repeating what he says throughout, that at every step of this process, we are confronted with the fact that these are not just the rules of thought, but also of being. I'm going to leave it there. Kyle, Jim, we've
Yeah,
got the mechanical object, we've got the process, and then we've got absolute mechanism within this chapter.
I do
Go
find
ahead.
interesting. We start off again with, in a way, a return to pure being in the sense that we're now with a indeterminate object. But at this point, it is an object rather than being completely indeterminate. So after mirroring that, we start to find, well, the ways that we couldn't describe before, like Holland Parks started to allude to, of the interaction between what we consider an object. So, like water, as we know it, is a as an object itself is made up of many different molecules interacting with each other physically. I guess is the best way to say it. To say that they. I'm trying to. What was I trying to remember from this? Something I didn't ever do was go back to the logic. It's the lesser logic itself.
Yeah, the lesson logic. Remember, we went through mechanism,
Yeah.
chemism, and teleology as well. So,
Oh yeah. It's just sort of a summary of everything here. In its immediacy, the object is only the concept in itself. Initially, it has the concept outside of it, which again is kind of like almost trying to kind of like it's kind of like the essence shell, the essence, but then it's sort of completely indeterminate again. In every
It,
determinacy,
it's interesting because when we get up this far and we start to try to conceive actual, real, concrete reality objects that correspond to mechanism, we always find that our any example that we could bring up is necessarily incomplete. And I think what you just read there about how it's correct in its notion means that you can conceive of this aspect of matter or of thought, but it's only an incomplete aspect of matter or thought. Like you couldn't actually find an object, right? That is purely just made up by mechanism, right? Like this, right, was made up by processes including chemism, where you have several substances and then they're slopped together and then they're baked in an oven, and then they're refined up and shipped off, right? So we're not talking about like complete reality objects, and it's easier to think about it as a thought object because it's literally an aspect of the total thing that is made up, right? But emphasize put it we're putting the accent on the mechanistic side of things, where all of the things that make up the totality are things out in themselves already. They're self-subsistent. They'd be themselves whether they were related to all the other things or not. And that's kind of the key of how to think about it, I think. Yeah, what do you think?
Just kind
Well,
of, oh, go ahead.
go through the chapters. It's basically arguing that there's a dialectical progression in the way we apprehend objective reality.
Yeah.
We start with mechanism, but we then come to realize that mechanistic worldview is incomplete and is internally contradictory as well. You can't really, squeeze, actual reality into a completely mechanistic worldview, which is why we then proceed to chemism. And even chemism is not, in its in turn, is not a complete. It's not. It doesn't provide a complete picture of reality either.
Yeah, you just hit the nail on the head there, Jim, because like with me, I'm trying to think of like an individual object, and it's going to be necessarily an incomplete
Yeah,
picture of an object. But when you try to universalize that into an ideology, and then
yeah,
you look at the world through a mechanistic point of view, and you get things like, what Bogdanov and some of those early Soviet folks who are trying to steer away from Lenin's dialectical point of view were
yeah.
trying to get at. Very much they were sticking with, I think, what it's hard to conceive of how you would operate within this ideology except through picture thinking. Like you would literally have to imagine a reality in which this works. It doesn't work, of course, because we know that it's far more complicated than just mechanistic. There are also chemical processes that go beyond just the mechanical, right? But for the mechanists and many others, over the centuries before the 20th century, people would
And
engage in magic thinking, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
in the going historic, 17th century, we had the emergence of a mechanistic worldview in the work of, say, like Descartes. And he developed a mechanistic account of physiology,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and you had people like Galileo and Newton, who were developing a mechanistic worldview in physics.
Now, that's not to say that a mechanistic worldview, when it was first developed, was necessarily a bad thing, because
No, not at all.
it replaced something that was far less clear about even the fact that several things could combine into a unity or a
Yeah.
totality at all, you know?
Yeah. Um,
Well, before they had, say, mechanism in physiology, you had the vitalism from going back to Aristotle,
And
and
that's where you
that
get
was
like,
that was what was
yeah.
replaced in the 17th century.
And so you've got the soul objects populating real objects and giving them life. I'm guessing that's what it
Yeah,
was. Is that about right?
yeah. I mean, and actually, vitalism continued on through the 19th and even into the 20th centuries.
Yep. With the Nazis, they were definitely vitalists.
Yeah,
I think it's kind of the point that's interesting though when it kind of starts to realize we can't get everything mechanistically. Like we get uh the theory of phlogiston is like I think that was what fire as a combustible body
Yeah, that's right.
that led to nowhere, and that's better explained through chemism. and through like by the end of the like 19th century, we're getting to the point of the end of science because we're going to get ready to explain everything, which is entirely a mechanistic viewpoint. What was it right here from remind me from the Harris? It was Lord Kelvin refused to be satisfied with any explanation of physical processes unless it could be presented in the form of a mechanical model.
Yeah.
And then right from the fact that it was the electrical magnetism was unexplainable mechanically, what led to the Maxwell, Planck, Einstein, etc. onwards the 20th century revolution. Ugh. But I guess
Yeah.
it is interesting that even it's is kind of I guess like you can't talk about these two chapters like in too much depth without having to explain in relationship to the other ones other than I do
Yeah.
want to call out that I haven't played around with the Hegel keeps bringing up the syllogisms.
Yeah, he brings up the individual, the particular, and the universal. You notice that that's sublated into the discussion because it's intimately part of the discussion now instead of being a separate thing. Now that we've covered it, like it's part of the structure of thinking about mechanism, thinking about chemism and teleology. You have to deal with all three of those things and how they affect what being mechanical actually consists of, I guess you could say. Um, which means it's quite complicated.
Yeah,
uh,
I guess that there is a reason. Even when I went through physics in college, we kind of had chemistry on the side, but the general physics for scientists started out with basic mechanics and then went on to electromagnetism and other things that'd be more chemistry, chemists.
yeah,
Although I don't know we got anywhere near the. I guess you kind of have to go toward the theological, which you haven't done here in the Hegelian sense, because I had to, try to figure out this conception of what object is and how it develops at this point.
yeah,
I think it started to make sense when you like see the same thing through the three different aspects as you further determine the object. Like water, it mechanistically makes sense. It's just sort of a fluid, flows around, has certain properties, but it's not all it does. It dissolves things itself, does break down in chemical reactions to hydrogen and hydroxides.
yeah,
And then that by itself is incomplete because now that's where we get down to like water is used to is part of erosion, that sort of thing that eventually leads further on to life because there is the notion it is self-determining itself, but that's like next week.
Also,
But
with the water, you have the water consists of hydrogen and oxygen atoms, but oxygen and hydrogen by themselves have a different set of physical properties than what water has. So it's the issue of emergent properties
mhm.
that are not maybe not may not be reducible to the properties of hydrogen and oxygen taken by themselves.
That's helps a lot. So chemism is the kind of description of an emergent property.
Yeah.
Okay. That's a better way for me to conceptualize that.
yeah, yeah. And
It, it's just
I really feel your pain and not even being able at this stage. You're not even really able to, like you said, talk about one without the other because they're so interrelated. In how we in the modern day think about this stuff, you
mhm.
can't help but think about it as interrelated. Like the earlier ones, like being, determinate being, all of those things, and you're talking about like the infinite, and it's easy to sort of talk about them one at a time because they're so unfamiliar an object. But you get up to this point, and it's like they're too familiar. They can't sit separately. I think of I think of what what's his name from Star Trek? Uh, discovery, who was talking about how physics and biology are the exact same thing at the quantum level, and it's true. And if you're enough of a scientist, that's exactly how you think of it, right? Let's change.
On
I'll be right back.
also
All
in
right.
Hegel's day, chemistry was just starting to really develop. Dalton was basically responsible for turning the atomic theory into an actual scientific theory as opposed to philosophical speculation. Atomism as a philosophical speculation goes back to antiquity to like Democritus. And later on, Epicureans made their contributions to ancient atomism, but it was not a scientific theory as such. You couldn't. It was entirely speculative. But in the early 19th century, atomic theory becomes an actual scientific theory, and it was in the early 19th century that people started the idea of molecules began to develop, and that became the basis of modern chemistry. So Hegel was just at the right time when all that was going on.
Yeah. Just something as I was reading this chapter, or this section, it was pretty much kind of Hegel having to use the pictorial representations of his time, or mechanism itself makes sense, but chemism definitely seems to be more of his era than today. We might
Yeah,
call it something else, but
in Hegel's day, that was still pretty new.
mm-hmm. Man,
Also, keep in mind that the atomic theory was well accepted among chemists even in Hegel's day, but among physicists, it was a different story. There was a lot of skepticism about atoms among physicists. And you can go to the late 19th century, early 20th century. Ernst Mach was the great skeptic concerning atomic theory. He would have none of that. He says, "Well, you can't observe atoms directly, so it's nonsense to even posit them."
and of course now we can directly observe
And in
them.
fact, it was really Albert Einstein. It was one of his 1905 paper on Brownian motion that really convinced most physicists that atoms were real.
Oh yeah, Brownian motion. I need to go.
So that was 1905. As I said, Ernst Mach would have none of this.
That just tangentially reminds me. Was it Brownian motion was used to prove more of like the Fermat's last theorem or whatever? Not Fermat. Sorry.
Einstein was able to show you could
Riemann.
measure
Remont's conjecture is like
you could
that.
measure the sizes of atoms and molecules
Yeah,
and the masses and so forth.
it's just somehow that same math is used toward proving one of Riemann's hypothesis, where you got that non-trivial line of zeros at the half. That's yeah. So it's Riemann on Riemann manifolds, maybe. Okay, it's like toward solving one of the $1 million problems. Anyways, welcome back.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I was listening the
Have a
whole
night.
time. So yeah.
Yeah, I know it's that
Um,
time of night for you.
what's that?
It's that time of night for you.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and the kids are off school tomorrow, so they're all you know, sort of just tooling around, and finally I was like, okay, you've probably got to get to bed. Don't want to neglect them.
So
So yeah, like I know what he I heard what you said, Jim, and I know what he means when he says chemism because I know what chemistry is, and he's sort of trying to talk about like what happens when what makes up the totality is related to each other and what does that look like logically? And so he wrote out the chapter, right? Um and then he talks about the objective free notion is end. And we'll get into teleology next time, or maybe we could talk about it this time. I don't know.
yeah,
I'm I'm a little rusty on teleology. Maybe we'll wait till next week to fully hit it. Because yeah, it's one of those yeah, I mean, yeah, it's one of those notions that still to this day has a lot of negative connotation to it. Everyone who says something is a teleology is using it derisively toward whatever they're talking about. Like, oh, well, it's someone's purpose, and so it has nothing to do with what it actually is. Well, actually, you know, when
Even
you talk,
Mark, even Marx sometimes used it as a sort of a pejorative.
yeah,
isn't that
For
though?
example, when Marx first read Charles Darwin's The Origins of Species, I think he wrote a letter, I think it was to Ferdinand Lassalle about it. And he says one of the great things about it was that it banished teleology from the natural sciences.
mhm, yeah,
And that's and, the way, and a lot of people, that's the way probably most biologists still view it that way. I mean, that was, there are ways to bring back teleology, oh, that's compatible with Darwin, and some of that, and Hegel probably points to how to do that.
yeah,
Trying to remember, wasn't that why Frem in his debate with the other guy on emancipations was kept referring to reverse theology as like it's the non there's a part of theology that's used in one direction to justify the purpose versus the other way around where well then the set where the objects lead to the purpose from the like from the other direction. I'm still vaguely only able to describe it, but I think
yeah.
that's
It's
fair.
usually like a subjective teleology. They're almost always talking about, whereas Hegel, when he talks here, like in 733, he's talking about an objective teleology. So in on 733, he says the third syllogism, which on the one hand is the restoration of the preceding processes, on the other hand sublates the last remaining moment of indifferent bases, bases, the wholly abstract external immediacy, which in this way becomes the notion's own moment of self-mediation. The notion, which has thus ablated all the moments of its objective existence as external and posited them within its simple unity, is thereby completely liberated from objective externality to which it relates itself only as to an unessential reality. This objective free notion is end, right? So if you think about all the things that make up a totality, realize that they mix, and then through the logic of them being able to do that, they are what they are freely as themselves. The end of that combination is the object itself, right?
Right.
Like even putting it that way, it sounds very banal, very ordinary, almost like duh, it's common sense, right? Well, it's not actually common sense to put it that way, but that's exactly the point that Hegel's making, and he calls that the objective teleology of the object. You know, it is what it is through what makes it up and its self activity, so forth.
Yes, it is interesting, but it makes sense that when Frem called it reverse theology, it is in fact objective is in a way the reverse of the subjective, right?
Y- You know what's funny? The very next page, he directly says this. He says, where purposiveness is discerned and intelligence is assumed as its author. And for the end, we therefore demand the notion's own free existence. Uh, and he goes on, teleology is especially contrasted with mechanism, in which the determinateness posited in the object, being external, is essentially one in which no self determination is manifested. The opposition between efficient causes and final causes, between merely efficient and final causes, relates to this distinction, and this distinction taken in a concrete form is also made the criterion for deciding whether the absolute essence of the world is to be conceived as blind natural mechanism or as an intelligence that determines itself in accordance with it. See, so even up to today, the modern debate isn't even isn't even pointed at the target that Hegel wants us to look at. It's like way over here. You can either reason mechanically or you can reason through faith and religion. There's no such thing as what the object is in and for itself. That's Hegel's position. Hegel's like, no, neither of those is good enough to account for what the object is.
The antinomy between fatalism, along with determinism and freedom, is likewise concerned with the opposition of mechanism and theology.
Exactly. It, it,
Yeah,
I swear I didn't read for tonight. I just rattled it off, and then I looked down and I realized I'm just restating what Hegel says in the next sentence without looking at it. That
because
happens all the time with this shit. Every single time I do this, I
because
get that,
things
and I'm like,
haven't
yes,
changed. It's still the same problem.
yes, yeah, no, it is, and it's a perennial problem because people aren't, people are still brought up with these mythologies about an external creator, or on the other hand, with blind fate and chance and um, uh, mechanism, basically. You know, you go and read the Selfish Gene or whatever, and you've got a modern variant of mechanism with bells and with little modern frills attached to it, and this is why we're rationalists as Marxists, because we know that this stuff works as it is because it is, right? And you can give the logical account of how that comes together. But for some reason that's not what's taught in the schools. Um, God, it just uh, it just really chaps my ass that this, he's teaching this in high school, okay? The period in which he composed this particular book, the full articulation of it, he was a high school principal. Okay, guarantee you, all of the high school teachers and principals probably couldn't have touched this if they tried. From my youth, I could be wrong. I could be very wrong about that, but consider that for a moment. Just a high school principal, and he gets it better than even 21st century debates. It just boggles my mind how stupid.
Go
Um,
reread that one new book that's supposed to continue Steve Hawking's concept of time, where it
mm,
has the most like like I cannot conceptualize the philosophical argument this person's trying to argue because he's like utilizing such understanding terms of the old philosophical debates as if they're like the ones that's rejected philosophy using.
yeah,
I could not parse it.
and the thing is, Kyle, this is difficult to read, but it becomes easier with repetition, and eventually you figure out everything that he's getting at. And he puts it in pretty plain language, relatively. Contrast that with all the scientific journals today that leave everything in jargon for their internal audience only, right?
Huh.
If we wrote something for the public along these lines today, it would be light years more understandable than what's left in scientific journals today. Like that's what the general public should come to expect. And as Marxists, we believe that a society is, and now I'm editorializing to the audience. As Marxists, we believe that the general public, everybody, is capable of administering society, and should be allowed to, right? Because they're all capable of things like this, okay? Because we're all endowed with reason, every single one of us. I'm, I'm not going to say it's like a democratic principle. It's more like what we are, our human species being, a phrase Marx used in his early writing. But he's exactly right to put it that way. Like, because we're human, we have this facility. All it takes is education and training. And Hegel was a big stickler in his career, in his day, um, of what he called Bildung, education, and the spread of that, widespread, um, to continue the legacy of, I mean, not just the French Revolution, but I mean, basically that. Uh, Marx somewhere talks about how Germany expressed the French turn, the revolutionary turn in ideas, and Hegel's part in educating the public despite censorship was part of that, I think. Um, anyway, I spent too much time around Doug, and uh, Doug, Doug tends to uh, inspire a bit of the agitator in all of us, and I think I really think we need more and more of that.
That's also why we need Bigfoot to properly win this year, not have his election stolen.
Yep. I know. Well, we'll find out tomorrow, I guess, or Wednesday.
Probably the end of the week, possibly.
It's one of
Twenty
those things.
twenty. It took
You,
almost all week.
I know. I'm really hoping. Look, first of all, it's not my battlefield. The Democrats' victories are not my victories, nor is it either of ours. Um, if you guys don't mind me speaking uh, for you as Marxists, but I really hope it's a landslide other way, so we could just be like, okay, well, next channel
I think I
instead
saw
of
some.
dealing with it for days.
Yeah, I heard someone give an example. Thought of day of having a bunch of mini January 6th in local areas that may lead to some of them trying their own sequel, January 6th.
I've heard about like National Guard units, especially on the north in the Northwest, gearing up specifically because that's such a hotbed of just nutso gun-toting, and you know,
It has. Well, it's been a hotbed for several
I mean,
decades at least.
they
yeah,
did literally light ballots on fire. So
it's just dumb.
That's
Let's
what we
see.
get. That's what we get for not having an effective radical left.
Well, the left was dismantled in the United States in the 20th century, and it's going to take a lot.
So yeah, going back to the First World War, even
It's
you
going
being
to
in
take,
prison.
to be honest, to see the regeneration of the left. Um, it's going to take a series of crises that mobilize enough people to start building something. I don't think volunteerism is going to do it by itself. You know, we ourselves are what we would what we like to think of as professional revolutionaries in this age, but we sometimes forget that the professional revolutionaries in the previous age also had an entire infrastructure to call on, whereas all we have is, you know, what you see on the screen plus, you know, a handful of others. Um, the left is broken. It's been broken for decades.
And also, U.S. repression of the left is U.S. is probably the most of any of the major industrial countries. It's the U.S. that has been most effective at repressing the left.
Yeah.
More so than any European country. The Nazis probably came the closest to repressing the left, but they were never completely successful at that. It was because there still was an underground left even in Germany under the Third Reich. It actually was able to infiltrate the Nazi labor associations, and they were communists and socialists who
Yeah.
worked their way into those organizations. But in the U.S., we've had very effective repression going back First World War, really,
Yeah.
when Woodrow Wilson's administration decided to suppress the socialists. They threw Eugene Debs into prison. The immigrants who were involved in the socialists were kicked out of the country. And then after the October Revolution, you had the Red Scare. So that just continued what had already been going on anyway, and re-intensified it. So for the 1920s, okay, in
Yeah.
the 30s, there was a revival of the left, and mostly through the CP, the Communist Party, and the Trotskyists.
Yeah.
Yeah, but then came the Second World War, and well, the Trotskyists got repressed with the support of the CP.
Yeah, exactly.
And
And
the CP got bitten in the ass because after the war, they got repressed by the same way.
it's funny too because they helped organize the vote for the capitalist parties too. It's kind of funny that way. They weren't rewarded at all for that effort.
Oh,
It's kind of hilarious actually. But I just thought of something. If you look at Russell and Wittgenstein's philosophy and sort of their way of dealing with thought objects,
yeah,
Hegel's description of mechanism,
yeah.
I mean, it parallels it. They see philosophical objects as only existing in and of themselves, maybe in a totality, but they can be unrelated to each other. They don't have to be related to each other. So it's like Marxism in philosophy. It's purely mechanical.
Well,
It's more picture thinking.
it's not
Jesus.
just like Marxism. Russell was an admirer of Mach.
Yeah,
He didn't keep it a secret.
yeah. And I know people who are um, diehard analytics who say that all of this stuff can remain unrelated, and then they teach classes on Marx's Capital and try to pick apart the theory and get very upset when you start talking about the totality or about the whole, right? Because they're like, no, 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 that's not how it works. It's just linear and none of it's related to each other. Like, okay, you keep going, bud. So again, that's like Ben Burgess and Matt McManus and the Jacobin crowd are rife with analytic philosophers who are basically introducing Marxism into Marx, which is garbage. And yes, I will pound my hand on the table, Ben. I'm sorry. if you don't like that.
To keep one siding the dialectical reality again and again. It's just
They don't believe in dialect. Well, it's
I
not
know.
something it's not something you believe in. It's something I think that they actively misunderstand, and if you try to put it in plain language, they act like they didn't hear you. Like I'm sure that somewhere along the way those guys have come across something that makes better sense than most of the sort of like the positivist accounts of dialectics. But to acknowledge it, I think I I I honestly think they would lose their paycheck, and so they have to act ignorant. We have no idea what that is, whatever. Anyway, if you're watching Ben, that's a challenge. Call me on your show. I'll come and debate dialectics with you all day long because I have the handbook. Actually, it's 3 handbooks, but it's a syllogism, not just
And the Soviets went for all that too. So
Yeah, well, they tried, and then Stalin said, "Okay, we can't have this disagreement, so I'm declaring everything split down the middle. It's
yeah,
fine." Diamant is splitting it down the middle between Marxism and whatever we think of as dialectics. It's so sad. Okay, what else can we say about teleology?
I feel like I definitely want to come back around to it after reading it. That's
Yeah, yeah. Let's schedule next week to talk about teleology, because I mean, I guess I could read a few things here, but it would probably be a better idea if we just read it for next week, and that
something,
way
yeah,
we
something that
get all the way through it, the particulars, and then we could segue from that into the idea.
I think Harris, I think, points out as a nice kind of, foreshadowing of theology for me is, but in the modern sciences, there is a persistent tendency toward holism, a tendency which permeates the chemism typical of the subsequent phase and unites with organism to give us a universal teleonomy, which Hegel anticipated, into which we shall presently return.
Yep.
you see, you read the posted on the chat, but
Yeah.
what Chat GPT has to say about relating Darwin's principle of natural selection with Hegel.
Yeah, I need to get.
There's actually a lot. I mean, there's been a fair amount of writing. I think work has been done on that subject,
Yeah.
including some of it from Stephen Jay Gould had an interest in that stuff, and what I didn't post. I asked ChatGPT to cite some sources on that, and one of the sources it gave was John Bellamy Foster. So because Foster has, he's interested in relating Marxism to ecology, and part of that is, we're trying to work out the dialectics of ecology.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. The dialectical unfolding of the idea and Darwin's evolutionary principles. Um, I feel like even what Chat GPT gives here is a little bit too pat
Yeah,
because to be able to put it in plain language the way I did earlier by
yep,
saying that we're talking about the object defining itself as what it is through its combination and its mixture as what it is logically, right? We're 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 talking about being becoming being because it is, right? And that's even a more basic way to put it. The Chat GPT description, I think, doesn't even approximate that. I could be wrong. Because it says like, okay, so I'm just reading it straight off the thing.
Yeah.
Teleology parallels the emergence of functional complexity and apparent purpose, where the interactions of organisms within ecosystems or social groups seem to reflect coordinated behavior aimed at survival and stability, creating an appearance of goal-directed organization. So that description reaches outside of what these objects are to metaphor. And that to me, I'm not saying the metaphor of the picture thinking is wrong, but it also points outside of itself to justify itself rather than doing it internally, which Hegel insists on keeping it straight down the line internal so that you aren't looking outside of it for the picture of what's happening. You're simply following the logic. It's like a shortcut, right? Using metaphor. If you're teaching a class and you need a crutch to be able to get across some of these logical things that people aren't used to dealing with, it's a good crutch. But ultimately, what the object is with a teleological end based on its mechanism and chemism, it's a very different thing from saying it seems like it has a purpose rather than saying it has an objective end. You could say that they're the same thing, but they're really not. You're piling a metaphor next to a logical explanation. And early in the EL, he talks about how people start having problems with explaining things because they stack them side by side. Kyle, you were in the class this last Saturday. Hegel talks about that early in the EL introduction, that stacking picture thinking next to a logical notion, and which are your readers going to prefer? They're going to prefer the familiar object rather than the properly notion object, I guess you could say. And so you kind of shoot yourself in the foot. I get, I guess this is part of what goes into learning how to think, as the Marxists say, a little more dialectically, a little more in an organized fashion about these things, to where you keep it straight to the notion rather than having the notion depend on a metaphor outside it.
I mean, I think, isn't it in the phenomenology? The process does go from pictorial thinking to actual philosophical thinking, absolute knowledge.
Yes, exactly. And so to backpedal,
Yeah.
at least in the exposition of what the object is and what it's made of and its end, because it's that, to phenomenological explanations, it's taking a step backward. Back in, you're backing down the ladder. He made a ladder so you can get on the roof and start talking along purely scientific reasoning in order to do scientific work. If you back down the ladder, well, the only reason to back down the ladder is if you're trying to teach this to someone and you're trying to justify the point of view partially with picture thinking, and that's fine, right? But ultimately, they need to understand it in the form of the logical proof rather than just the metaphor. Because the metaphor, the picture thinking, or the sort of self-reference that he also talks in there about in there, is just going to be mere tautology. Something is because it is, right? This is dialectical because we say it is. We're Marxists. We know about this stuff, right? That's not a proof. Mere assertion and assurance is not an argument. Again, sorry. Again with my rhetorical grandstanding. Thanks, Doug.
Speaking of Doug, I got my copy in.
Hey, great. Awesome. Yep. Sunday nights. I'm beginning to get the picture here that I may not be able to uh I'm going to try to make it, but I'm skating on thin ice taking up part of my weekend already with the Hegel classes. And she's like, so we lose you Sunday night as well, huh? So I may or may not be able to participate directly, but if I have to do my reading and put it in, uh, some of my participation in on the chat later or before, that might that might be what I substitute in there because I definitely still want to read it again because I just got finished reading it this year, and reading it again is really, I think, I really want to go through it. So I'm definitely going to participate in one way or another. So I'm not blaming anybody for that. I'm not throwing my wife under the bus because she is right. The weekend is really the only time we're all four together for any length of time. So yay. So I know this is early, but uh, unless you guys have more to talk about, which by all means, we could knock it off and then assign the teleology chapter for next time.
Yeah. I mean, kind of like I was just going to say, I was kind of using the stepping stone. What was it? I did ask ChatGPT just for an example of what object is kind of as viewed from the initial mechanical to chemist to teleological.
The teleology, yeah,
Which I think the best one for me was water. You can think of water mechanically, holistically, like the rain cycle, whatever. Eventually, you realize it involves chemistry. Like it actually, and then eventually it's part of like in life systems. It actually is used as a purpose continuously rather than like it's to transfer nutrients around to it's part of the chemical buffer system, whatever other parts.
yeah.
I think that really helped me kind of better grasp this whole chapter or section.
Awesome. Okay. Can you cut and paste some of that into the chat
Okay.
just so we can review it? I actually think that's really helpful. It's good stuff.
Pictorial thinking, but it's also internally derived. So
Yeah. 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 Exactly.
figure it out.
Thanks.
Good. No, okay. I'm good.
Well, cool. All right. Well, we'll leave it there for our audience, and next time we'll be covering the teleology chapter and getting deep into that. Uh, I th it's definitely a long enough chapter that we can actually cover quite a bit. So, all right, everyone, have a wonderful week. Hopefully, hopefully the election results come in fast. But if it's like every other year since literally I started paying attention to it, it's not going to be. I don't think I've ever seen a landslide.
Oh,
Um, it's always been like 49, 48 for days. And,
and now we've been there since 2000.
and yeah, and we know Trump is the king of lawsuits either way. He's going to be calling people and bringing in lawyers to say this and this and this. And,
It
you
happened
know,
last time. Yeah.
yeah. But
So the voting systems have changed too since
yeah, yeah.
the
In the
well,
last,
it was all done. Everybody voted on election day, and that was it.
oh, yeah.
You have early voting and you have mail-in voting. In a lot of states, the counting starts with the voting on election day, which is usually through machines. So that part is fast, but then they have to do the early voting and the mail-in voting. And those are paper ballots. And
Yeah.
they have to open up the envelopes and pull out the ballots and count them. It's all by hand.
Isn't that crazy? Yeah.
And a lot of states they do it after they've done the counting for voting that occurred on election day. So that's what makes it so much long. So the whole process of vote counting nowadays it takes days to do it. And
I don't understand
in the
in the yeah,
battleground
yeah,
state where no margins probably no more than might be just 3 or 4 thousand
yeah, yeah, exactly. And
counting it all up and getting it right. It can take a good week.
it still boggles my mind that in this age of what was supposed to be the paperless society, we're still doing it this way.
Yeah,
And the fundamental reason is we don't trust each other.
yeah.
We're like, yeah, yeah, we have to put lots and lots of security on this. So, you add another hoop and then another hoop every year, and now Trump is like, well, if I don't win, he takes the LaRoucheite route. Okay. If I don't win, then it was rigged. Like,
He's
okay,
already said
buddy.
that he will not accept if he will not accept a victory by Harris.
Yeah.
He said it outright.
He also can't.
I mean, it's not the first time he didn't. Remember 2016, he was saying the exact same things.
Yeah.
He says he would not, he wouldn't accept a victory by Clinton.
That's because he can't picture loss ever. So
Yeah.
he can't handle
Yeah.
it.
He's deeply immature, but you know, that's uh yeah. What chapter?
No, it's just
Oh, it's fan art. Okay. There we go. I've been following the news. I say it's a new series, but it's quite it's been going for a few years now. So it's something called Don da Don, and they dropped it into anime form this last month. Uh, Kyle, have you ever seen Bleach?
yeah.
All right, think Bleach, but think if Bleach was done as a romantic, like a shoujo romance, complete with all the monster art. That's pretty much what it is. And anyway, everybody's going nuts over it, and so I'm trying to catch up with the comic book version because it's way ahead of where the anime is. So yeah, it's good stuff. All right, everybody. I'll see you next Monday, and Kyle, I'll probably see. Well, I will see you on Saturday. So
Yeah.
I guess we'll get into the preliminary conception again.
Yeah.
It's like we keep going over the same shit, only this time it actually feels like I understand it
Yeah.
a lot better. Um, yeah. Have a good night, everybody.